and welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alasdair McEwen, and in this week's episode, I spoke to Dr Rob Ralston, a lecturer in public policy at Edinburgh University, and the co-author of recent research into the political dominance of the plastics industry and the political economy of plastic production. Rob is an expert in global health and environmental politics and has been researching the political influencing strategies of the so-called petrochemicals bloc, a grouping which he will explain more of in our conversation. Bertie last year interviewed an expert from the Environmental Justice Foundation about the UN Plastics Treaty negotiations, and Rob Ralston's work examines in more detail the lobbies that have been built up around influencing such international negotiations, and the interesting way the concept of the circular economy appears to have been diluted and possibly co-opted by the plastics industry.
It's so universal, it's so embedded in everyday life that there are therefore so many different sectors and corporate interests who all have a vested interest in maintaining the use and production of plastics.
To begin our conversation, I asked Rob to recap where the world now was on plastics production.
So in terms of plastic use, a very widely cited stat is that in 1950, global plastic production was at around 2 million tonnes. By 2021, it surpassed 390 million tonnes. The second important stat, or one that is very widely circulated amongst people working on the political economy of plastics or just plastics, is that the demand for plastics is forecasted or projected to triple by 2060. So in terms of the trajectory, you have this almost exponential growth in plastic production and therefore consumption. And more importantly, plastics and petrochemicals are seen as an exit option for many of the largest oil and gas companies, including many state-owned enterprises. As demand for fossil fuel reduces in energy systems, petrochemicals and plastics are increasingly seen as a way for companies to shore up markets to protect profits. So not only is plastic production massively expanded over the past 5 decades, but in the coming decades, it's expected to grow even faster. So this is really the problem that advocates and researchers, environmental justice campaigners are confronting at this point in time. In terms of where we're at with plastics and the plastics crisis, it's interesting that we've had this punctuated model of interest and concern in plastics. So in the 1990s, you have this real spike in political interest and public concern around plastics as single-use plastics become widespread, as plastics begin to substitute for more traditional materials such as glass and cardboard. And many people would associate this with the early environmental movements around recycling, this idea of eco-modernism. So all this occurs in the 90s. And I think you have essentially a period of what you might call quiet politics around plastics. From around the 2000s up until around 2015, plastics recede into the background somewhat. I think maybe as climate becomes the real dominant environmental issue over time. Now we're in this period again of this real spike in political salience and concern around plastics. What explains that, I think, is a combination of things. It's public attention to marine pollution, the impacts on wildlife, which definitely was a contributing factor. There are various other political economy factors, such as China heavily restricting its import of plastic waste. And then finally, I think what we've seen in the past few years is human health becoming this real pressure point, both for industry and an area where environmental campaigners have really begun to push on, I think, recognizing that this is something that can drive public interest, concern, and pressure to address plastic waste, pollution.
Maybe you could explain the power structures which now maintain this plastic dominance, or the dominance in plastic being globally consumed.
Yeah, so in terms of the drivers of plastics use, there are many different industrial sectors who all have a core interest in continuing to use plastic and continuing to produce it. And if you maybe compare that to another area, let's say the tobacco industry or tobacco, where you have a single commodity, a cigarette, which is actually universal, it's simple. In contrast, plastic is one where there are a huge number of different corporate interests at play here. You have integrated oil and gas companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, a number of state-owned enterprises who all have an interest in continuing to produce petrochemicals as part of their portfolios. You then have consumer goods companies. In particular, I focus on the role of big food companies. And for them, it's really a case of plastics having functional properties and being sufficiently cheap for them to be able to expand their markets for things like ultra-processed foods. In addition, you have fast fashion. You also have pharmaceutical companies who rely on single-use plastics. If you think about things like blister strips for drugs, these are just some illustrative examples, but this is a point made by Adam Hania, who's a political economist who focuses on oil. And one of the key points he makes is that plastics and petrochemicals are the means by which oil becomes woven into our lives. And I think that's a really astute observation. And maybe one that then helps to think about the political economy of plastics is that it's so universal, it's so embedded in everyday life, that there are therefore so many different sectors and corporate interests who all have a vested interest in maintaining the use and production of plastics. That maybe explains the increase in production and demand, and it's all bound up in consumer culture and consumerism, and you really see that emerging in the Second World War, and it almost turbocharges that. This idea of disposability, I think plastics are almost essential to the model of consumption that we currently have.
It's a huge, complex structure which exists. And I think it might be good, therefore, to now just go into a research paper that you published, which was really about the power structures that try to influence the UN Global Plastics Treaty negotiations, which were last year. I think it'd just be really useful to go into that, because that way we can have a mini case study.
Yeah, in terms of the Plastics Treaty, it's a set of negotiations that I've been following for the past 2 to 3 years. They have stalled, they're still ongoing. The circular economy has many different definitions. So there's quite a well-cited paper that talks about there being over 100 different definitions of the circular economy. So it's impossible to capture the concept comprehensively. I think it varies in terms of radical it is. There's definitely versions of the circular economy that are focused on degrowth even. In plastics, the most influential definition is one developed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and it's really about the contrasting what they call a linear economy with a circular economy. The idea that you can move to a closed loop system if you imagine plastics looping in systems, and they imagine this happening via recycling, but crucially actually through reuse and reduction. Organizations like Ellen MacArthur, but also Greenpeace, other NGOs, have really tried to encourage a shift towards reuse and reduction. And by reuse, it's often not reusing plastics, it's substituting for different materials. So you might imagine restaurants or retail settings where customers are essentially leased items that they then bring back. So you have bowls or different cups that are reusable. So this is the version of the circular economy that has been most widely used. So this idea of a shift from take, make, waste models, the linear model, to a circular model. How that plays out in practice and in concrete commitments is something that we've looked at in our work. And specifically, we were looking at how the corporate version of this is one that has very much narrowed and shifted attention away from reduction and reuse, much more towards recycling. And so therefore, reframing the circular economy largely is one of looping plastics through recycling. But in terms of the work we've been doing, based on this fieldwork, it's really exploring how certain concepts or certain ideas can be strategically used by corporate actors to try and influence the terms of debate and shape the agenda. And so in some of the work we've done, we've really focused in on the circular economy as arguably the dominant corporate sustainability concept, and one that has really become ubiquitous in this emerging field of plastics governance. And in the paper, what we look at really is how, or what we try to explore is really how the circular economy, a potentially quite radical idea, has become progressively narrowed in ways that begin to detach it from its radical origins to something much more narrow and much more bounded. The reason being that for industry actors, what they really want to be able to promote is a combination of individual responsibility and waste management and recycling. So essentially measures that avoid or try to divert attention from questions around unsustainable levels of production to what we might term downstream actions. And so the circular economy has been used to try to create this impression that it's possible to have plastics that can be almost infinitely looped through recycling. The way in which corporations have tended to use this is to suggest that it's actually possible for plastics to be continually cycled. So if you had, for example, a single-use plastic bottle could just be looped over and over again. But we know there are pretty hard limits to recycling plastics. There's only so many times a plastic bottle can actually be recycled without that plastic becoming unusable as another bottle. And so inevitably, what happens is that many plastics become downcycled. So they get used for construction materials or made into bags or less valuable plastics. But this is what often happens with plastics. There are significant technical and commercial limitations to current recycling methods that make it difficult to realize this vision of a circular economy for plastics. But in the paper, we really look at how through various multi-stakeholder initiatives and voluntary regulatory initiatives that have been spearheaded by corporations, both on the consumer goods side and on the petrochemical industry side, how these partnerships have continued to promote and create very persuasive narratives around circularity, around the idea that a circular economy for plastics is possible. That's been very influential in plastic treaty negotiations. It's notable that a number of civil society organizations no longer use the term circular economy or even circularity, and instead prefer to use or will often refer to them as false solutions. And I think that's quite illustrative of the extent to which corporate interests have essentially co-opted and captured the idea of the circular economy, that NGOs are no longer willing or they're very reluctant to actually use these terms.
I was surprised to read in your paper that Exxon, DuPont and Dow actually introduced, for example, the 3 chasing arrows that you kind of see on most plastic labeling. I wonder if you could take us into some of the detail around the actual lobbies that were built up. You talk about the Alliance to End Plastic Waste and also a Global Plastics Action Partnership, which both seem to have been quite successful lobbying operations.
What we ended up focusing on was really based around fieldwork at negotiations and just tracking what corporations were doing, how they were lobbying, what public relations strategies they were pursuing. And where we ended up was really focusing on these multi-stakeholder initiatives because they became the voice of different industry sectors, which is fairly standard for companies to speak collectively through things like trade associations, and in this case, speaking through multi-stakeholder partnerships where we identified there's 2 or 3 in the plastics treaty, and they divide somewhat neatly along petrochemical and consumer goods lines. So on one hand, you have the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, and it's essentially a petrochemical-led initiative. And it was created by the American Chemistry Council, the lead trades body for petrochemical companies in the US. And it was in response to growing concern around public attention to the marine pollution crisis around 2017 and 2018. So you had essentially the brief that was given to Weber Shenwick, which was the public relations agency charged with developing the branding for the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, was to change the conversation away from simplistic bans of plastic to real long-term solutions to managing plastic waste. That was the brief that they're given. And I think sort of captures the purpose of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, which is really to try to shift the attention away from the production of plastics towards waste management. This partnership committed $1 billion in US dollars to trying to address the plastic pollution crisis. Up till this point, they've actually allocated very little of that budget. It's somewhere between 150 to 200 million over the past 5 years. So in terms of the claims made when the partnership was formed, it's actually very kind of at odds with the actual distribution of grants. More importantly, what the Alliance to End Plastic Waste have tried to do is to suggest that they try to make plastic waste seem like a bankable opportunity or an investment opportunity. particularly in the global south, because petrochemical companies and the Alliance to End Plastic Waste is very acutely aware of the imagery, the visuals around plastic waste in South and Southeast Asia, in Africa. And so what they've really done is to try to target what they might term plastic hotspots or plastic waste hotspots in various countries, in particular Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Ghana. And what this partnership is trying to do, or what I would argue the impression it's trying to create, is that there is a huge amount of investment opportunity in recycling infrastructure for plastic waste. And this is really the strategy that they've pursued, is that we don't need to reduce plastic waste. A key objective for the Plastics Treaty is to have a production cap. What the Alliance to End Plastic Waste are trying to do is to shift attention and say, the real problem is insufficient waste management. And as long as we de-risk investment through our grants, we will crowd in private finance, we'll crowd in private equity, and we will catalyze investment from development banks. And all of this will create a waste management infrastructure that will mitigate the problem of plastic pollution. That's what I would argue the petrochemical companies are doing. I think the way that they've done that is very clever, in the sense that they have aligned with ideas around a just transition. So they present what they're doing is advancing a just transition for the informal waste sector. There's a fundamental tension at the heart of the vision of a just transition that's being proposed by the petrochemical company via the Alliance, in the sense that in many of these settings, informal waste workers already collect most of the valuable waste. So in increasingly formalizing waste infrastructure, the potential is that you actually end up excluding these informal waste pickers. That's a very complex issue, one that merits additional discussion in other work. On the other hand, you have consumer goods companies, primarily big food companies, so Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Nestle, Unilever, Mondelez, and others, all of whom rely on single-use plastics. I would argue that their business model, in particular for products like ultra-processed foods, which are the profit centers for many of these companies, is essentially reliant on single-use plastics, because single-use plastics are cheap, they're lightweight, they're technically very sophisticated and can keep foods fresh for very long periods of time. But I think most crucially, they're disposable. And the business model for many of these food companies depends on disposability, depends on single use. So for them, it's a case of, through their partnership, which is called the Global Plastic Action Partnership, in coordination with the World Economic Forum. And this partnership has pursued a slightly different approach to the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. They're much more interested in what's called extended producer responsibility. And what they're looking to do is to create global rules on product design, on recycling, and issues around that. I would say ultimately, often the strategies tend to come down to the same objective, which is really to divert attention away from the production of plastics.
And then going to the treaty negotiations themselves and the role that they played in those negotiations. Can you explain how they were then using their focus to negotiate and influence the process?
So I think in terms of the actual treaty itself, the corporations often have an outsized presence at negotiations, similar to climate governance with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Every time there's a COP, you'll see the numbers of fossil fuel lobbyists. And we've seen a similar situation at the Plastics Treaty. The environmental NGO Centre for International Environmental Law does a lobbyist analysis where it goes through the participant list and categorizes the different types of attendees or observers. And they consistently find that the number of lobbyists has increased over time. So at every negotiation round, the number of industry lobbyists tends to increase, but they often dwarf other categories of observer or organization. So I think in terms of just the sheer numbers, they often have a very visible presence. From what I've seen, often the influence can be quite subtle. It's not so much a case of necessarily influencing what's in the draft texts currently, although clearly that would be an objective. But I think it's really having the resources to host side events, big showcases, installations. The Alliance to End Plastic Waste, for example, book out and almost the entire top floor of a five-star hotel near the negotiation venue in Canada in 2024, where they had a huge showcase for what they call plastic circularity. And when I was there, when I was looking through the exhibit, you could see member state delegates being shown around, the waste management solutions, the circular solutions that the Alliance were offering and had implemented. So there are a number of events like that. I suspect a lot of the lobbying is essentially behind closed doors. I've seen lobbyists all over the plastic treaty negotiations. I have to assume that they are meeting with member state delegates. I guess I would also say I think a lot of this work is actually happening before or in the interim periods between negotiation rounds. And I think a really crucial point here is that many NGOs or environmental campaigners might only have the resources to go to the negotiation rounds, but don't have a sustained flow of funding or time to actually successfully engage with governments or with policymakers, whereas corporations clearly do. And so I suspect a lot of the influence is actually being exerted months before these negotiations actually take place. And I think the influence has already been exerted in this backstage that's less visible to researchers.
Yeah, so essentially the circular economy concept has been co-opted, captured. There are foundations that you even refer to in your research. There's the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, for example, that was, I guess, one of the earlier proponents of pushing the circular economy. I mean, where do they stand in all this?
I think the Ellen MacArthur Foundation are an interesting case in the sense that it's hard to think of an organization that's actually been more influential in popularizing the idea of a circular economy. In the period following the financial crisis in 2008, you have a number of sustainability concepts that emerge. In the early 2010s, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation were very influential in mainstreaming the idea of circular economy. And this is an argument made by other scholars, notably Alasdair, who's done a lot of great work on the political economy of plastics. I think over time, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation began to work with McKinsey and the World Economic Forum around 2015. And I think there's probably a juncture there where the agenda becomes slightly more business friendly and maybe to some extent becomes detached from the more radical elements that were arguably visible in the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's work prior to that. I think where its strategy essentially is to try to encourage companies to reduce their use of virgin plastics via compliance mechanisms. And they have what's called the Global Commitment, which is this voluntary scheme run with the UN Environment Programme, where they essentially report on corporate commitments to reducing plastics use. It's trying to work within the system as it exists to try to create pressure for companies to shift. I think the objectives of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation are legitimate and that the solution can be done through market-based mechanisms. I would assume that officials within the Ellen MacArthur Foundation would be somewhat disappointed in the level of progress that's been made so far. So to use a couple of examples, Coca-Cola and Pepsi have continued to increase their use of virgin plastics, even in the past 2 years. I'm not sure whether the strategy of trying to pressure companies through public reporting is necessarily going to be the most effective mechanism. I think the economic incentives for companies to continue to use virgin plastics is just so great that it seems difficult to imagine how that can be reconciled without regulation or without legislation of some form that really compel companies to shift to alternative business models. I would say Ellen MacArthur Foundation have a very influential voice in debates, but whether or not their strategy has been as effective as it would like is maybe an open question.
And doesn't this point to kind of the wider issue here, and that you make maybe in your paper about the relationship between business and policymaking and this idea of so-called kind of multilateralism? In certain contexts around, for example, this global plastics treaty, it's almost impossible to have agreement. I mean, I should add for listeners that your research hints that even if a plastics treaty had been successfully agreed, it would have been so limited in ambition, thanks to the lobbying efforts of the petrochemical bloc, that any new approved treaty have led to any significant reduction in plastic.
I think it would depend on the type of treaty that's negotiated. Something myself and colleagues have explored is whether in the current crisis, but also in the longer run perspective of increasing attacks on multilateralism, the erosion of norms of multilateralism, whether it's realistic to expect there to be new environmental agreements under conditions where the multilateral system is under increasing pressure and duress, and we're in a period of geopolitical competition. The multilateral system is under incredible strain. So I guess there's a broader question about whether it's realistic to expect a plastics treaty where the interests at play are so great, the potential tensions and conflicts are acute. Is it realistic at this point to expect us to get over the line? Having said that, I think if the more high ambition forces prevail in these negotiations, we are expecting there to be upcoming rounds. So I don't think it's necessarily over. I think it really hinges on whether there is a production cap in the treaty and whether or not the treaty addresses issues like harmful chemicals in plastics. If the treaty didn't address those aspects, then the risk is always that you have a very lowest common denominator agreement that might be worse than having anything at all. But it's tricky to the extent to which interests seem somewhat irreconcilable between a majority of states who support a strong treaty and petrol states who seem opposed to any suggestion of there being a production cap. I think that definitely makes for a challenging environment. And I'd maybe argue it's even more challenging than climate in some ways, simply due to the strategic importance of petrochemicals. As I mentioned before, as demand for fossil fuels declines in energy systems, petrochemicals and therefore plastics become more important. So it could be the case that plastics become an even tougher area to achieve multilateral agreement and consensus on.
Do you think there's any recognition of that now from governments? And I guess your research does show that, particularly on plastics, established interests dominate in the policymaking process. Is there any hope around that changing?
In terms of the dynamics of the plastics treaty, there is a majority of states who support a number of strong interventions on plastics. There's a number of states, particularly small island developing states, who have consistently been the leaders, the catalysts of action, trying to shift the debate and the discourse to these more progressive and transformative solutions. So I think that there's a real optimism there. Just thinking about the recent Santa Marta conference around the fossil fuel treaty, the idea of having a coalition of the willing who are working towards phasing out fossil fuels. Many of the same states, delegates who are involved in plastics are also involved or have been involved in that conference. I think there are real grounds for optimism in that regard, that it's both the majority of states and within that there are several states who have taken a really strong stance on trying to address the upstream drivers of plastics pollution. There's really it comes down to the ability of states to veto progressive action. And ultimately, that comes down to the way that multilateral decision-making works, that if the decisions have to be taken by consensus rather than majority voting, then all it takes is one state to essentially block action. And we've seen that in the climate space, and it's also been present in the plastic space. If it is possible to change the voting rules, which a number of NGOs have really been pushing for, and I think this is becoming a major strand of their campaigning, is around the procedural aspects. If that's possible to change, then I think we could see really transformative action. We could see a really strong plastics treaty, but I suspect that will require a change in the voting system so that one state can't veto decisions. I think that's what it might come down to in the upcoming rounds of the plastic treaty talks.
Going back to the beginning of our conversation, you talked about the tobacco industry as a kind of an example of something that's changed quite significantly even in the last few years. And now, at least in some countries, people don't smoke as much as they used to. Are there any comparisons that we can make with the tobacco industry? You also talked about Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and their dependence on single-use plastics, and then the relationship with ultra-processed foods, which is probably something that we could talk about in another interview. Is there anything to be said on that? Because it does seem like these are extremely powerful interests that are not really going to change without really quite strong public policy measures.
Yeah, I've previously worked on, just before I talk about the political strategy side of things, I think it's a really overlooked fact that cigarettes are one of the single biggest drivers of plastic pollution because of microfilters in cigarettes. And so I think the single most polluted item is actually the cigarette. You wouldn't necessarily think about. I actually ended up researching the plastics treaty because colleagues who were working in the tobacco control were attending the plastic treaty in the talks. They got in touch with me to just flag this as they thought I might be interested. So my route in was through the tobacco industry, which was unexpected. The common refrain is this idea of a tobacco playbook and how other industries have looked at the tobacco industry and tried to copy its strategies. There is a playbook, but the playbook is adapted for different contexts. It's much more sophisticated and complex than might be commonly understood. I think with the tobacco industry, maybe because we have millions of internal tobacco documents that were released as part of what's called the Master Settlement Agreement in the US, we know how sophisticated the strategies were, how complex, how well-funded, how long-term they were. In climate, over the past 10 years, increasingly there's been research that's highlighted the extent to which companies like Exxon were using very similar strategies to the tobacco industry. Crucially, the main one I see a lot in plastics is not so much the idea of obstruction, it's more delay. And what tobacco companies really understood was this idea of manufacturing doubt. It's something that Naomi Oreskes has worked a lot on this, that all you need to do is manufacture some degree of doubt about the harms of a product or a commodity, and that can be sufficient to delay regulatory action. That's the biggest lesson or the biggest parallel, is that tobacco companies became aware that overtly denying the harms of tobacco was no longer a viable strategy, and that they would be better served by trying to manufacture doubt through the funding of science, through public relations campaigns and so on. And I think you really see that with plastics, where it's about creating a sense of skepticism and doubt, for example, around the human health impacts of microplastics. It's all it requires is creating some idea of uncertainty, whether that's scientific or regulatory uncertainty. A lot of petrochemical companies or plastic companies or the consumer goods sector are really focused on trying to not so much obstruct, but to delay. And that can be through promising new technologies. It can be through trying to individualize the problem, try to create doubt, uncertainty about things. So the parallels with tobacco are very apt in that sense. And at the time that the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was negotiated, which is this landmark treaty negotiated by the World Health Organization, I think a lot of corporations looked at the tobacco industry and thought, we don't want to be a pariah in the way that the tobacco industry is or has become. A lot of the efforts have been trying to avoid the fate of tobacco companies. And so there's a number of lessons that these companies have drawn from. And finally, the revolving door between tobacco companies and the fossil fuel industry and the petrochemical industry is significant. A number of tobacco executives subsequently went on to work for big food companies. Philip Morris, like a major tobacco manufacturer, they were later incorporated into a company called Altria, who bought Kraft Heinz. So there's very close links between tobacco and food. There's lots of different linkages between the tobacco industry in terms of their personnel, the strategies, but more importantly, there's a lot that can be learned from the tobacco experience and how to counteract that as well from a campaigning or an advocacy perspective.
My thanks to Rob Ralston for his time. As I mentioned before, there's also an interview with Bertie which goes into more detail around the UN Plastics Treaty negotiations, and you can find this alongside Rob's suggested reading list on our podcast blurb. Thanks to Vasco Kostovsky for audio engineering the show. If you enjoyed listening to us, do give us a review and follow us, and if you haven't already done that, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with a new interview. My name is Alasdair, and once again, thanks for listening.